The El Paso Massacre, the deadliest Latinx massacre in U.S. history, was also the deadliest white supremacist attack in the United States in more than 50 years. The assassin, Patrick Cruces, told the police that he came to El Paso to kill Mexicans. In the immediate aftermath of the killings, Texas Governor Greg Abbott and his Republican colleagues have been tenacious in their efforts not only to whitewash the El Paso Massacre, but the entirety of Texas's dark history of slavery, racism, and violence against Latinos. The repudiation of the 1619 Project, the creation of the 1836 Project, and the fierce resistance to teaching critical race theory are indicative of attempts to whitewash history. There are several significant points argued in my essay. The El Paso tragedy was not an aberration. It is the deplorable culmination of more than 2 centuries of white supremacist ideology's growth in the state of Texas. Anglo-racism against Latinos may be found in the very first contact between Anglos and Mexicans in Tejas. The recent atrocities at the U.S.-Mexican border have deep roots in the genocide of Native Americans and in the slavery of African Americans. What's your response?
I agree with you on the overall perspective. I think the young man, when he massacred the people in El Paso, it was his perspective that Texas is becoming too brown and that he had to stop this. And his perspective was that too many Mexicans are immigrating to the United States and changing the culture of the United States. So he's already misinformed and thinking that the Southwest, not just Texas, has always been a place where the groups are diverse. So that's one point. The Texas has a very long history of discrimination against Mexican American, indigenous people, and of course Black people, and it has been historicized. It was historicized through the legal system, the implementation, the interpretation of the land grants, the institutionalization of slavery. And the treatment of the Native American populations in the removal of the populations from Texas and placement in the reservation, and then for the Mission Indians, such as those from Isleta, the taking away their land and just leaving a small plot of land where the mission stands today.
One of the things that hit me, and I'd written this in my article, was this kind of concept of ownership. I read that manifesto 20 times. It's not a long manifesto, it's only 4 pages, but I read it, and the reason something new would come out. And it seems like this ownership, his perspective, my Texas, my country, right, my land, the Mexicans are invaders. And what he does, and this is very similar to other people that have written white supremacist manifestos, is that he wrote in there, I am not the aggressor. I am not the instigator here. I am the person that's preserving my culture. He really depicts himself as somebody, right, who is a defensive kind of a person. And what it really does for me is like the irony, it's almost laughable that the Mexicans and the Mexican Americans, they are the invaders. Right. He's just trying to preserve, and he's drawn, he's at his wit's end. He's got to defend his culture. But this kind of idea that resonated with me, I may not see it correctly, yeah, was the idea of, I own this. These Mexicans and Mexican Americans, they are a threat to my culture. And the other thing that goes along with it is this kind of concept that I saw, the connection with other right-wing manifestos, which I read, is the replacement of white people. Right. White genocide, yeah, as you've talked about, the browning of America, right, as a threat.
Yes, this, it leads me to think about the work of Neil Foley in his last book, in the making of Mexican American. I believe that's the term.
Was this the White Scourge one? Or
No, his third book.
His third book.
In which he states that he criticizes the concept of the browning of America, not only for its racist implications that America or the Southwest should solely be white, but he argues, he says, the American Southwest has always been brown. Mm-hmm. From the beginning. It's the Native Americans, Asians, Black people, Mexican Americans. Of course, with the migrations from the interior of the United States, it became a majority white region. But the browning of America, it's been brown mm-hmm. for centuries.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an interesting point. I'll try to make the connection basically with Patrick Crusius and some of the people that are the Texians, the first Anglos right. that start pouring into Texas about, this land is for white people, talking about white supremacy. In the manifesto, Crusius was very much against mixed races right. taking place. And so I kind of took that manifesto and I could go back in history and I said, boy, I can find this in the 1820s, or I could find this in the 1830s. So there seemed to be that connection. And I think I'd just been taken by the idea of who belongs in Texas and who doesn't mm-hmm. belong in Texas. And I think that was established very early when the Anglos started to pour right. into Teos. Now, one of the books, and I feel a little guilty because I only read this, I think, probably a year ago, but it had such a profound influence on me, is they called them greasers. Right. And in the very first chapter, not only the very first chapter, the very first line, that Arnoldo de Leon asked the question, if Anglos had never had any contact with Tejanos at all, where was this animosity? Where was this conflict? Where was the racism? And what he does is he gives three main reasons for that. He talks about largely the genocide of Native Americans. He talks about slavery coming out of the South. And then he talks about the Spanish, laws and the Spanish legend and how important that was to get it going. And then what I really like about the book is that the chapters are like 11 pages or 12 pages, they're not long, but they're incredibly pithy. Mm-hmm. You just look at this, and the very beginning to me is like this preoccupation of Anglos with color, the preoccupation with hair texture, the preoccupation with mixed blood taking place from almost from the very beginning. And I started to read, the original primary documents, and I would read what people, the Texians in their diaries. There really seems to be this obsession with color, and I started to write it down mm-hmm. where individuals from Mexico were described as copper-skinned or mm-hmm. gold-skinned, a swarthy cinnamon, or black, and even to the point of jet black. What did that book do to you? What do you think was the achievement of De Leon's book? Right.
Well, when I read De Leon's book in the late 1980s, it was part of the literature that I was examining at that time, dealing with the concept of placing race at the center of the analysis. And I think De Leon was part of that school of thought that said, let's go back and examine the role of race. I think before De Leon, his work is foundational. Before that, a lot of the work on Mexican Americans focuses more on the Spanish heritage. And what De Leon does, he really looks at the not just the ethnic prejudice, but he looks at the racial prejudice. And he begins to deconstruct the whole point that when the Anglo-Americans came, they were trying to justify the conquest, Texas independence, as a project to civilize the nation from the people of color, indigenous people, justify slavery, and then argued that the Mexican people were basically a mongrel race that was uncivilized and was not really going to be able to settle the state. And they ignore the whole fact that the Mexican Americans had established an infrastructure in Texas, which subsequently they took over the homes, the land, and of course the whole political structure. So De Leon really examines the issue of how race was a centrality in the history of Mexican Americans, not just ethnic prejudice in terms of that the Mexican people are Spanish descent and Mexican descent, but he problematizes the study of Mexican Americans.
Yeah, that's great. When I read that, it was very interesting. Again, very pithy, not long, but it really gets to the heart of the matter. And one of the things that I kind of believe he's almost like the father of the Mexican other, like the very beginning before critical race theory was really out there, and many people have followed his work, after. But just what's interesting to me is that what I think I learned from it was like focusing on the Mexican other, what to say that I identify you, or the thing you hear again and again. Mexicans are lazy people.
Right.
Mexicans cannot be civilized people. Mexicans have a very superstitious religion called Catholicism.
Right.
Mexicans will work 2 hours a day so they can put food on the table, and then they can't wait to go gaming, so they're gambling and they're playing the music. And what's interesting to me is that when I talk about the Mexicans, or when some of the Anglos were talking about Texans, they're also talking about themselves. So it's not just, if you say that Mexicans are lazy, you're saying you're the opposite. I'm Protestant. I believe in the Puritan work ethic. I work very, very hard. It leans into the justification. Mexicans will never civilize all of this land. It's not in their DNA. It's not in the chemistry. And I found that very interesting. That it's a two-way. It isn't just talking about somebody else. It's saying what you're not. So if you say the Protestants are hardworking, the Mexicans aren't. If you focus on the U.S. Anglo-Protestantism, said, well, this religion is superstitious. If you look at the mixed colors and you say, hey, we're not that, and you can look at you have looked at the primary source materials where I can say like, Sam Houston or John C. Calhoun or any of those vaunted folk heroes that we have. Why would anybody who is white ever be ruled by a mongrel race? And I heard you say that word mongrel. Of all the words that I've seen in this period through letters and diaries and histories, the word mongrel surpasses all other. There's this almost like obsession with kind of mixed races out there.
Right.
And it kind of, for me, kind of set the tone to look forward. There's another thing that maybe you can talk about that really moved me, and it was about the Fandango.
Right.
And the reason the Fandango, not just because of the dance, but in that book, in the book we're referring to here, is an interesting guy that this white individual comes to watch the Fandango for the purpose of castigating this lady. This is a lewd act. This is lascivious. You're showing off your body. You're doing all of these gyrations. So this guy comes with this mindset from the United States of America. And as the story goes, it's so moving. He starts looking at her beautiful lips and her high cheekbones and her brow. He's falling for her. And the reason I think this is important, not because he's just falling for her, but to me, it's almost like a clash of civilizations. Your dance is lewd, it's lascivious, that's not what women ought to be doing. I'm Protestant, my work ethic and my religion, and yet you kind of see this connection. You ask somebody who's Mexican and doing the Fandango does not have those connotations. You know, it's a very different thing to talk to somebody who is Hispanic and say, what does the Fandango, you know, represent to you? What did it represent to, you know, white people? And to me, I see that clash.
Yeah, I think De Leon does an excellent analysis based on primary research on the archives of San Antonio and then I believe Goliad, and then later on he looks at Laredo. And what he found is that at first the Anglo-American population would attend all of the celebrations of the Mexican population in relation to the Catholic Church, the parades, and gradually they began to outlaw all of that. So the treatment of the Fandango was very similar to how the public parades, the Catholic public parades of the Mexican population were outlawed by the city through the municipal laws. But yeah, the Fandango, I think it was exaggerated in terms of the how the Anglo-Americans were viewing it. That was immoral, the type of dancing, that there were card games going on, but the Fandangos were primarily fiestas, and I think it was just part of the need of many of the municipalities that were controlled by the Anglo-American population, that they just didn't want these public affairs, Mexican public affairs, to be there anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's why the outlawing in the Fandangos was really part of the larger laws that required licenses to have public events. And so it's just the transition of cultures, and it's also the beginning of the marking of the territory for purposes of segregation. Sure,
that's a really important point. I know that this is a difficult question because it's such a broad question for you, but I'm interested. I often focus, for example, on Anglo, racism, and then it's like you can always go back. It's like rewind the film, and you're talking about other aspects. We're talking about Spanish racism, other racism, which you deal with in your work. Can you provide an overview? Again, I understand an overview of the legacy of racial discrimination in the Southwest from 1570 to 1898, which is the focus of one of your books.
From 1570 to
1898
to 1898. So you mean in terms of Mexico in the 1500s?
Yeah, I guess what I'm focusing on the fact is that maybe I'm starting with racism with Texians, and everybody has said, hey, listen, racism, the Spanish came, there was racism with the Spanish, and I actually took the dates out of your book.
Yes.
So that I went through that because I thought, well, that's a very interesting when people have dates. So, but so you're talking about from the 1570s, the Spanish are introducing racism, correct? Right.
Yes. What I didn't know if you wanted to go that back far. Right. After the Spanish conquest of the central Mexico, especially the Aztec Empire, the Spanish gradually controlled what today is Mexico. And a lot of the conquest was really done through making alliances with the various nations of Mexico, specifically the Tlaxcalans. And by the 1570s, the Spanish had really taken political control. Their alliances were strong. They had removed the kings and chiefs and governors, caciques, that had resisted now, and they had promoted a lot of the lower level caciques that were not in line to govern the indigenous population. So they had solidified their system. So they introduced the casta system, which is a legal system by which privilege is ascribed. with the Españoles being the Peninsulares and the Criollos, who have superior legal rights. Then the mestizos, based on your racial mixture, or Afro-mestizos. Afro-mestizos is an academic term, and there were various other terms that were used for determining the blood quantum of the individuals. And then the Indians, of course, were part of the casta system. It was a free system. People who were enslaved were not part of the casta system because they were slaves. So a legal system is established, but once the movement to the frontier of what today is the United States of American Southwest, it was a territory that was populated by many indigenous groups who did not welcome the Spanish, and therefore it would be difficult to recruit settlers. And the Spanish, of course, invested heavily in the military, in moving the populations north. But primarily, the people who were willing to move north were people of color, indigenous people, mestizos, Afro-mestizos, and of course you had Spaniards born in Europe or born in Mexico, but they were given many opportunities in which the casta system in terms of occupations was waived. An individual who was a criollo, married to a mestizo or an Indian or a black woman, these individuals would be able to raise their children as Spanish. In terms of the social circles, people were given land grants, and so the casta system was very flexible in what today is the American Southwest. It was more of a cultural element in terms of being part of the pobladores who would establish settlements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things you realize the intricacies and how complex all of this is, and I think everybody learns, how to play the game. But I realize that some people that would come into, Texas would say that they were from the Cannery Islands, right. And they were from the Iberian Peninsula, and someone said they would be higher up on the hierarchy, and then someone did work and found out that the people in the Cannery Islands had already had mixed relationships in the Iberian. But my point is, it's almost like a assimilation and learning what the game is. If you're going to rise up here, you say you're a peninsulare. You come from Portugal, you come from Spain, you come from the Canary Islands. Right. And it becomes very, very intricate as people start to set up their kind of hierarchies. So one question that kind of goes along, and you can help me here, a book that really influenced me was Reginald Horseman talking about Manifest Destiny. And I had only recently read that too. I think when we're in class, we like to use the generic, the Manifest Destiny that's always part of the, the class. But what was interesting was kind of intertwined with Manifest Destiny was this Anglo-Saxonism, this Anglo-Saxon, liberty and freedom. And what Reginald Horseman did was he kind of talked about the beginnings when Anglo-Saxonism was about constitutionalism, or it was about laws, or it was about colonialism. And it wasn't about this virulent racism. And what he does in his book is he kind of transitioned, like you might even look in the 1810s or maybe just before that, the turn of the century, you still talk, it was colonialism, and we might, we talk about Anglo-Saxonism as far as laws and stuff. But he starts to talk about like the 1830s and 1840s, that this idea starts to transition to a virulent racism, and he uses the actual, the period of Texas independence, or the Mexican-American War, or the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, to kind of show this, where a racial hierarchy is being set up. Right. Now it's getting, I'm up here, what I guess is that things are getting complex. And I'm thinking here in India, when the Portuguese first came and talked about the casta, they said, look at it, there were 4 main groups, and that was it. I mean, it was like society is reduced to 4 main groups, and of course society gets more complex, and there's more race mixing, and there's all this kind of stuff. I think the reason I was kind of interested so much in your work is that I'm looking at Anglos in the 1820s and 1830s, and you've taken this much further. You're going way back for where was this planted?
Right. Yeah. The one point that I need to emphasize is that when the settlers are coming in from Mexico, they are being governed by the Peninsulares, who are primarily Spaniards, and the military records show that they were Europeans. And so because the conquest of the Southwest was part of a Spanish growth, the growth of the Spanish Empire, but also, one point that is significant is that by the late 1780s, the Spanish crown is now viewing all of Mexico, the population, including those who say that they're Spanish, as really mestizos, and they begin to relax the casta system and allow the social mobility of all of the groups. And I think that's an important point.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but is that just kind of facing a reality, like Spain being aware this is happening?
It's facing a reality, and also Spain is fearing that the elite criollos in Mexico are going to demand independence because they are being restricted economically. So the casta system, the Spanish Empire in Mexico, is beginning to fall. And so therefore, in relation to Texas, what we have is a population who a large part is white, Espanol, but the majority of the population will be people who are racially mixed. So therefore, when the Anglo-American period begins after Mexican independence, in which they've abolished the casta system and instituted new citizenship laws, and then 1829 the proclamation ending slavery takes place. In Texas, therefore, they are left with the situation that the Tejanos are a very diverse racial population, in which the Anglo-Americans are not used to this type of inhabitants, and the issues over how to govern this population takes place. And the process of racialization really occurs, in which the Mexican population must be divided according to who they are racially.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but see similarities between the American Revolution, when the Americans become economically self-sufficient and they're getting tired of paying taxes, and they start asking questions why some little tiny island, controls them, and you see some kind of economic sustainability by certain people. Said, why are we paying taxes to Spain? Why is Spain controlling us? We are, looking after ourselves. We're becoming,
yes.
We can stand on our own 2 feet. So I see a lot of similarities, yes, with that. And also the complexities taking place.
I forgot to address the issue of the Cannery Islanders, and you're completely correct that the new scholarship that is coming out about the Cannery Islanders indicates that yes, they came from the old world, and they claimed they were Europeans, but they were already also a mixed racial population. And one point that is really important here in Texas is that when the Cannery Islanders came in the 1730s, they tried to institute a casta system by stating the land belongs to them, the water belongs to them. But the earlier settlers fought back and they said, no, we're not going to accept this. And the missionaries also supported them. And then the governors and the viceroys stated that, no, you must share the land and the water with the rest of the inhabitants. So they demanded their political rights, and I think that's something very important that happened in Texas, because you had the social mobility of people of color.
Right. You have argued for the primacy, centrality of race in studying the Southwest and for the study of Mexican Americans, and I think I kind of agreed with you. So I have two-part question: why have you focused on the primacy and centrality, and then the other work, and I can repeat it after. You have in your work have included blacks as significant political actors that often get left out in the story of their. So why the centrality and the primacy of race?
Well, I believe that ethnicity is equally important. Because the discrimination of the Mexican population based on their Spanish or Mexican heritage. But the centrality of race was that the people were racially mixed, and that was one of the reasons why their incorporation could not be the same in terms of giving them the same equal rights as the Anglo-American population, European population that are migrating into Texas. And because they were a racially mixed population, there was discrimination against them. They're not considered to be equal. They're not considered to be as intelligent as the Anglo-American population. And as we discussed earlier, they're considered to be immoral in many of their practices. And then to be part of a Catholic religion that is considered to be rather savage and dysfunctional in helping people move up socially.
Mm-hmm. I did a little homework on this, is that focusing on scholars that look at race, such as yourself, that there seems to be in some ways division where people will really focus on race and how discriminatory and how racist and how violent it is. And then there's other people that would focus on race and almost say, like, you know, these people really assimilated into society. There wasn't really a lot of conflict. There was a lot of cooperation and working on that stuff. How do you respond to that? What's in your kind of field where the conflict is about race?
Okay, well, you have to look at the racial formation before the Anglo-American migration into Texas, that, as we talked about, who were the settlers, and then also the after effects of what happened to the indigenous population. You have the indigenous population who remained hostile against the Spanish and the Mexican people, and these are the indigenous people such as the Comanche, Tonkawa, Karankawas, etc., that end up being placed on reservation during the Anglo-American period. And then you have the mission population, and then the Rancheria Indians that remained at a distance from the Spanish, who they end up being incorporated as the Mexican population. These indigenous people became Mexican. If you really look at today at the indigenous complexity of the populations in Texas, none of the groups who are federally recognized were indigenous to Texas. The Alabama Coshata, they come from outside of Texas. The Tiwa Indians come from Pueblo. So the much of the indigenous population was incorporated and it became Mexican. That becomes a very important point. Later on, during the Anglo-American period, it becomes important in regards to what happened to land. Indigenous people, people of African descent, Afro-Mexicanos, lose their land right unless they had purchased the property. And that was in the case of some of the Afro-Mexicanos. The Mexican population does have the ability to have their land certified, but much of their land is really reduced in numbers due to the establishment of the land commissions in Texas. So the centrality of race is that following the initial period, after Texas independence, there are attempts to pass laws that would lead to some of the Mexican population who fought against independence to make them, decitizenize them, and then for their children to be decitizenized for generations. And the Mexican population also has to go to court in many cases when there's overlapping claims over their land, and a lot of it is that these people are Mexican. They do not deserve the land. It's a new era.
So you were talking about mestizaje among blacks, Indians, and Spanish, and maybe in that kind of discussion, I think you shared some of your life and your family's life in your first book, and why.
Okay, right. Well, the mestizaje, from going back to the Spanish period, the church and the crown recognized that the marriages between indigenous people and the Spanish were legal, and they even encouraged it as a form of stabilizing the colony. And also based on the laws of Spain, the siete partidas, any person who had been brought or had been enslaved also had the right to marry. But only the children of black men and indigenous women were free. The children of black women, if they were slaves, were born slaves. So very early on, the Spanish developed a system in Mexico, and it differs across Latin America how the laws were interpreted, but that after Spain did participate for a short while in the transatlantic slave trade in Mexico, and it's estimated about 150,000 enslaved people were brought between about 1581 to around 1630, and that's when really it ends in Mexico. The people who were primarily brought to Mexico were men, so they had the right, according to the Siete Partidas laws, that they could marry freely, and the indigenous women were the only ones really available for them. So the children become free, and so you have a very large free black population in Mexico that eventually intermarries with the other indigenous people and with the mestizos. And there are certain regions of Mexico which are where the Afro-Mexicano population was located, such as places in Veracruz, Zacatecas, Jalisco, and so the mestizaje is basically just that the Spanish and then the Mexican then in the Mexican period, people would be marrying freely, and you have a mixed population, but you of course also have individuals who chose to only marry light-complected Spaniards, because during the Spanish period they did have limpieza de sangre laws, which were laws, and then la sanción pragmática, which was a law that allowed the parents to censure who your children were going to marry if they were under 25 years. So this law was used by some parents to ensure that their children only married other españoles who were generally criollos or castizos. But Mexico in general becomes a mixed race population. Even to this date, Mexico in their constitution states that they are of a plural race, and that they're a mestizo people.
Right. I found it interesting, and maybe you can help me with the connection. I'm not exactly sure, but when I looked at the manifesto of Patrick Crusius out there, he railed against race mixing, taking place. And, maybe I over-exaggerated the connection, but you can easily find that in the 1830s or in the 1840s, where people were railing, against that, and what would be, do you think, his purpose railing against race mixing today?
I think it's just that he sees more Mexicans and people from Central America coming into the United States, and that it endangers the white race in terms of he fears racial mixture, and it is just racism.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a legacy of some of that stuff that we've already
looked
at.
It's something. Who knows where he obtained that information from the schools, from his homes, from his friends. Yeah. I'm not sure, but
it was almost like he was saying this was like it's despicable, it's sinful, the race mixing, and I'm wondering if it's one of those things that it's harder to detect when you are somebody that mixed race as opposed to somebody that didn't. Again, depicting the Mexicans as invaders, the Mexicans as outsiders. If you have mixed families, like people are talking about lighter complexion, or where are you from, or how do you fit into the racial hierarchy. Maybe it's more difficult to pick somebody out, when there's racial mixing. And he talked about a ethno-state, talking about having 90% of the population white, in these ethno-states. So I'm just wondering if there's any kind of connection with the things in the past. I did talk to you just a second about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and one of the things I picked up from your book is that how did the process of the racialization of Mexicans change with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in Texas? For example, how was citizenship determined in terms of race?
Okay, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed that the United States would respect the land rights of the Mexican people, and it did not state that they had to have titles. It was basically the land that was occupied by the Mexican people. The United States also agreed that the citizenship would be given to the Mexican population. The problem is that this all happens before the 14th Amendment, and at that point in time it was really unclear what was the relationship of the state in determining citizenship. And what after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, U.S. Congress gives the states the right to determine how to treat the occupied population, and each state decides differently on how the populations will be incorporated. In Texas, it's a little bit more complicated because most of the decisions had been made in the 1840s during the stage of the Republic, and they decided that they would give all of the inhabitants in Texas citizenship, except if they were indigenous and if they were black. But that meant that the mestizos would be given citizenship, but there were attempts to prevent that. Sure. And that's related to a lot of land grant issues. But then in New Mexico, which was the territorial legislature, chose to give citizenship to all people in Mexico, in New Mexico. But since New Mexico was a territory, U.S. Congress had the right to void their citizenship eligibility requirements, and they rescinded the right of Native Americans and the blacks to be citizens. So, and then in California, the Texas legislature was controlled by the Anglo-Americans who were the majority, and they chose that only people who were white would be citizens of the United States. That was their interpretation. The issue was left very vague in terms of who is white, because they didn't say Mexicans, they didn't say that we are upholding the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They just stated that the citizens of the United States were white people. That later on creates problems for the Mexican population, because in the De la Guerra case of 1870, after the Civil War, Pablo de la Guerra, who had been the lieutenant governor and then was a judge, was charged for improperly acting as a U.S. citizen, because they charged that he was not part of the white population. And so they were trying to decitizenize him, because they were trying to argue that he was more Native American. And he goes to court, and he wins the California Supreme Court case, but the court issues a very vague position. They state that Pablo de la Guerra must be considered as part of the white population, because there was no evidence proving that he was indigenous. His father actually had been a peninsular, but they did not have any records of the mother, because allegedly the records had been burned. And so, but then at the same time, in 1870, they uphold the California Constitution, which only recognizes whites to be citizens. And so it's a very convoluted decision, but it becomes clear that only if you are white, you are a citizen. And then Texas later on is really the main case in which the U.S. government finally, or the courts finally, clarified the political status of the Mexican population in R.E. Rodriguez. And in R.E. Rodriguez in the late 1800s, the Republican Party and then the Populist Party had tried to prevent Rodriguez from applying for U.S. citizens through naturalization, because under naturalization law, only white people could apply for U.S. citizenship. But after the Civil War, U.S. Congress had made an exception for people coming from Mexico. And so in the case of Rodriguez, therefore, they tried to prevent him from applying for U.S. citizenship on the basis that he is fully part of the Native American population. And so the research has to be, the courts have to do research on all of the treaties, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Naturalization Treaty of 1769, which U.S. Congress agreed to give citizenship to the Mexican population, and race was not part of the issue. They study the treaties of Louisiana, and so they conclude at the end that treaty law, the Congress had agreed to extend citizenship to all of the occupied population. So then the argument was that you could not use race against the Mexican population, because treaties clearly had stated that the populations obtained from Spain and then from Mexico would be given citizenship. So in 1898, that policy is clarified, because within the Populist and Republican Party, their main arguments had been that the Mexican population, regardless if one of the parents is an Anglo-American, could be citizens, because indigenous people in the United States are not citizens of the United States based on the 14th Amendment and the naturalization law. So the Rodriguez case clarifies the law that yes, they are citizens, and it becomes very important because this is a period when immigration now is beginning to increase to the United States as a result of the dictatorship in Mexico of Porfirio Diaz.
Sure, absolutely. I have a couple. I hope I can make them quick questions
Sure.
for you. I'm having empathy for you
No.
because it's we're all this, and I think these will be really kind of a quick one. But do you view Crucius's comments, I mean the manifesto, as a continuation of the racism that you have spent your life studying?
Yeah, yes. What I see is that after the civil rights, and then the states beginning to when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, and afterwards when the states really begin to implement many of the federal reforms, which doesn't happen until the 70s, late 1970s, things do improve immensely for African Americans and all people of color, including Mexican Americans. We're given the right to compete. And that's really what we wanted, is the right to compete. And so the case of Crucius is that he does not want people to compete. He does not want brown people to come to the United States and then be able to compete as any human being can. But the racism is more subtle. I think in Texas, a lot of the issues or the civil rights battles that we have to look at are really the redistricting and ensuring that African Americans, Mexican Americans have the opportunity to elect representatives of their choice. And I think that's the new area that the civil rights organizations like LULAC and the GI Forum in the NAACP are focusing on.
Yeah. As Stephanie L. Canizales and Jody Vallejo have argued, and I'm quoting them here, Trump and his administration tapped into white sphere of replacement due to demographic shifts, rising economic inequality, fear of the non-white other and the Latino other, overt white nationalism, and a long history of racializing Latinos. And what I was picking up on, I mean, the gist, the upshot is that, Trump didn't start the fire, but what he was able to do was to really pick up on about 200 years of the racialization of Latinos, and it was very easy to tap in. And this kind of idea, which I said in Crucius, and it's interesting, not just in Crucius, he borrowed from other in New Zealand and San Diego, this real fear of white replacement was a big deal. Economic disparities, taking place, the browning of America. And so what these two authors, these two scholars have kind of argued that, it was like somebody put all the kindling there and then Trump just set the fire. So do you see this racialization of Latinos as kind of the kindling for Trump to step in and do what he did?
Yeah, yes, because I think that if you recall, in California, the SOS movement, which I believe was in about 1987, that Governor Pete Wilson used the invasion of the Mexican people of California as the causes for the economic problems in California, and that became very, very effective. He was reelected. And so I think that when there is economic problems, people are afraid, and they therefore begin to say who should have the opportunity to compete. Mm-hmm. And so in the past, it was very easy to prevent minorities from competing by not allowing them in the networks, by having the freedom of determining who will be employed and who will not be employed, and by creating a sense of superiority by having separation in all social accommodations, or segregation in the public sphere. And in that empowers a person to feel better. If I have the choice, the right to determine what is a shared public place, that makes a person feel better. But I think a lot of the economic uncertainties is always based on who can you blame and who can you prevent from competing, so that you have better chances of mobility or of winning. And unfortunately, the legacy of viewing Mexican Americans as an ethnic or racial other still continues to function.
The tropes that I can find in the 1820s and 1830s are still with us today. I even found out this, the rapist from Mexico. There was a fear in the 1830s that Anglos talking about men of color raping their white women, the laziness that we talked about, the lack of them can't assimilate. I heard that through the 50s and the 1960s and the 1830s, and taking it to the present, the same kind of repetition of the tropes. I have one last question. I hope we can get it done in about 2 minutes to kind of finish up. I have empathy for you. Some of these questions are very heavy duty here. One of the things that I want to thank you so much for the interview while we're talking. I really enjoyed it, but I think I'm historian, that in this world you have to focus. One of the things I was saying about Frank de la Teja, he talked about global racism, so that we know that I totally agree with him. But my book isn't on global racism. Like anything, we have to take a topic. You take a topic in your anthropology. We do this. So the reason I wanted to write, or at least explore it, is that there are a couple of people, David Dorado Romo, an El Paso historian there. He spent some time saying we live in a war zone, and we've all known this, and he's very upset when people talk about mental health and lone wolves and too many video games. He says, let's call this it's a hate crime against people. Of course, that's his opinion. And I think what I was trying to do in my work is to say, not only is it important, like, I don't think it was an aberration, so I want to go back and I want to see where I can find it, and you've taken it farther or further back for me than the Anglos and stuff like that. But also looking at as a theme, for something that's very broad, to bring it together. Do you think that race and racism and racialization through this period are concepts to tell the story that we're trying to look at? As I said, if I went to they called them greasers, and said, if these Anglos, as we said in the very beginning, don't even know Tejanos, where's the animosity, where's the violence, where's the racism and stuff like that? So in your work, you deal with race and racism and racialization. Are those fruitful ways to tackle the history that I'm looking at?
Yeah, I think so. I think that we are still living in a period in time in which people are discriminated against socially, and also in employment, depending on their location. That the color continues to be a reason to include or to exclude, and we don't live in a colorblind society in which race doesn't matter. It does matter. I mean, when you see people, you see that they are of different races, and it cannot be ignored. And I think this movement against critical race theory, first of all, it's misunderstood. Critical race theory is taught in the colleges in terms of examining the role of law in legislating laws to privilege certain groups and to discriminate against certain groups. It's not promoting hatred, but it is looking at the legal system. But critical race theory also examines how the laws were changed and became unconstitutional. So it's also the study of that. And so I think it is very important to examine race in terms of determining how people are classified, how they are treated, and just to also to ignore that race had no role in shaping social class differences. I think it's a mistake.
Well, one of the other things that I argued in the, and I'm going to finish this in 1 minute, but I think one of the things I wanted to argue that's twofold. I argued talking about racism and racialization, but I also think that whitewashing of history that we have, particularly in Texas, but elsewhere, but particularly I think in Texas, is to me it's like a festering sore that we just want to, we kick the can down the road. I think when I was talking with Ana, Valenzuela yesterday, one of the things that's very interesting, you hear people say, oh, we don't want to make our white children cry. We don't want to make them feel guilty for the things that are in the past. There's this real emphasis, which kind of makes me laugh, to protect the white people by negating the story of the Hispanics. And as I said, if you want to talk about the Battle of the Alamo, then we should talk about slavery. If you want to talk about the Battle of the Alamo, we should talk about racism. We should talk about a land grab. We should talk about Tejanos that don't feel American. We can't leave their story. We can't leave the slavery story out there. What I found is that the college students that I teach, they're interested in this. It's not like they want to be shielded. Usually that's when they come alive and you said, I've got something unsavory to talk to. My students don't know about the lynching of Hispanics in the 1920s in Texas, not about the Bath riots or the Salt War or any of those things. So it's almost like the same sustaining of let's protect these white people because they have an unsavory past, but at the same time we can't tell this other story, even with the demographics that are changing, kind of drastically. And I also thought that this whole idea with the 1836 project, it's like emphasizing white achievements in the creation, and because it's 1836, you negate all the indigenous populations and everybody else's.
Right. Yeah. That's terrible.
Yeah. So I want to thank you so much. I just feel like uplifted, and I feel like already it's a good day.
Good.
I really enjoyed the interview.
Well,
thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.